This time on Poll Hub, Buckeyes, Tar Heels, and smartphones? We're looking at the data in our two latest battleground state polls, our second this season in Ohio, and our first in the surprisingly close North Carolina. Both states have retiring Republican senators, and both could be Democratic pickup opportunities, but will they be? Then, by this point, nearly everybody in the U.S. has a cell phone, and most have smartphones. I mean, do we even use that term anymore? Yes, they are incredible devices, more Star Trek than Alexander Graham Bell, but at what cost to us as human beings? We're going to look at that, and we end with a seasonal fun fact. Literally, seasonal. Yeah, stick around, we'll explain. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I'm Lee Berengoff.
We're back in the States. We've been in the States, battleground states, all fall as we get very close to Election Day now. We have been in Ohio for the second time, but we want to start with North Carolina. It's our first time in North Carolina. It's a state that not a lot of people put on the big board back in the beginning of this cycle. North Carolina has been a state that's been a little out of reach for Democrats, despite the fact that there's a Democratic governor there. And it didn't look like it was going to be a particularly competitive race, so there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it, or not as much as some of these other states we've talked about. But maybe it should be, and in fact, it has gained a lot of attention recently. Two candidates running for this open seat, Ted Budd, the Republican, who's a congressman in the state, and Democrat Sherry Beasley. And it's tied among registered voters in our new poll, 44-44. Bud is ahead by 4 when we look at definite voters. Lee, what do you make of this?
Well, I think the key thing here is when you said it's an open seat, and Carolina has also been a state that's been sort of not quite purple, but the Democrats sometimes get near it and have tried, and both at the Senate level and the White House level. And I believe Barack Obama may have carried it back several cycles ago.
He did, first time around, yeah.
Yeah, but they've come up short ever since. I think this is a close race. It's an unexpectedly close race. I think one of the things I'm seeing here is that the parties are performing fairly similarly in that the people who say they're definitely going to vote, Democrats and Republicans are neck and neck on that. The people who say they strongly support Beasley, among her supporters, 69, very close with Budd's 65. The congressional generic question, the Republicans are only up a point in there. So I think one of the differences here is in how different groups are falling out. And I noticed that in young people especially, which is, of course, a key Democratic constituency. Among the adults, they are at 21% of the electorate, registered voters 20, but then when you look at the definitely votes, that falls to 13%. And so we saw that among young people. We also see it among women. So the two key constituencies for the Democratic Party are sitting on the sidelines, or more likely to sit on the sidelines. Although we're going to see what happens in the next couple of weeks, because sometimes fire lights late in among certain groups of voters. And I would just say only one thing additional on that. The Biden approval rating in the high 30s. And again, Democratic candidates running above Joe Biden. Be easier if he was more popular, I suspect, for them. But just Joe Biden being unpopular doesn't make it an automatic hold for the Republicans in this case. Close race, the edge goes to the Republican because of the definite vote difference from the registered.
Lee, when we take a look at independents, we'll see that Beasley and Budd are pretty much tied, but there is a notable proportion of independents who are still undecided. They're at 17%. With a few weeks left to go until Election Day, is this common to see that proportion, that type of number of independents undecided at this point?
If you look at the non-voting group, but the people who are going to fall out, independents are more likely than partisan Democrats or partisan Republicans to fall out. We see that in states throughout when we have a higher independent group. That's not surprising. What I do find interesting, though, in this is when you look at the favorable, unfavorable for both of these candidates, the word identical might be overused, but here you've got a identical favorable, unfavorable, unsure for both Beasley and Budd, and the unsure still in the 20s.
Before we move on to Ohio, I just want to mention we always ask about issues in these battleground polls, and we ask what is the top of mind issue, and ask voters or the people in our poll to pick one. That doesn't mean they aren't interested in these others, and Lee, you point that out every time. But I think it is, it's interesting to find out, well, what's the one issue that's top of mind as you go to the polling place? Inflation's been number one in every state that we've looked at, and it is here. 38% among those definitely voting or saying they're definitely going to vote, 27% on preserving democracy, and 15% on abortion. We commented early in this cycle in our first polls that were in September that abortion seemed to be this driving force among Democrats as we got out of July and into August. But wasn't showing up in the polls, and it continues here. 15% say abortion, 38% saying inflation. I'd note that 23% of Democrats say inflation in this poll, which is in third place, but it's a quarter of Democrats saying that. And I'd also note that independents, who we just talked about as being the late deciders, 40% of them say it's inflation. And there's no gender gap. So 36% of the women in this poll say inflation is top of mind. Second place is abortion at 22%. But again, inflation is driving the conversation in all these cases. The other thing that we ask about is how fair people think their local government will be in administering the election. And we've seen a wide range of results here, especially the partisan difference between Democrats and Republicans. In some states, there's been a 50 percentage point change or difference between Democrats and Republicans. Here, 92% of Democrats are very confident or confident, 68% of Republicans. That's a gap. But I think at least it's somewhat promising to me that a big majority of voters in North Carolina feel like, yep, elections are fair and accurate. To me, that seems like a good sign, right?
Yep. And then what else we got to do? We have more states
Ohio.
here, right?
We have Ohio.
I almost forgot Ohio here.
So this is our second poll in Ohio,
Yeah.
and the trend is what makes this interesting, right? Whenever we're able to do a trend, there are two races here. The governor's race, Mike DeWine is the incumbent Republican. He's well out ahead. Let's talk about the Senate race because it's another pickup opportunity for Democrats and a hold opportunity for Republicans. Tim Ryan, the Democrat, at 47% among those definitely voting in November. Not October, and J.D. Vance, the Republican, at what's the number? 47%. It's a tie. This is what we essentially saw several weeks ago when we polled at the end of September. What does this mean, Dealey?
Well, one thing it means to me is look at both races, the governor's race and the Senate race. And what we usually see increasingly is a partisan divide, and we see that. But we also see emergence now of candidate qualities making a difference. So there are 15% of people who say they're voting for the Republican Governor DeWine, but also voting for the Democrat Congressman Ryan. And those 15% really are the tail of the tape right now in terms of making this a close race. And look, Ohio's been one that has become increasingly a red state, except at the Senate level. And what's interesting is, of course, there's a Democratic senator already in Ohio, and maybe there will be two. Right now, it's about as close as you can get. Yeah, Mayor, what were you saying?
Yeah, you mentioned, Jay, the importance of trend. We're looking at the Ohio survey, and we did notice at least one noteworthy trend point in terms of issues, and that is that inflation in Ohio remains the top concern, but it's jumped up from 36% to 46%, and it's now the top concern for 22% of Democrats. Jay, what do you make of this?
So this is the largest number we've seen in any of our battleground polls for inflation. It's nearly 50% of voters say this is top of mind. We have not seen anywhere near that number in any of our other battleground polls. And you're right, it's jumped up 10 percentage points in a month. I think what this speaks to is that some states feel it in different ways than other states. And Ohio is a state that has been an industrial Midwest, we used to call it, and I'm not sure maybe we still call it that. I know it's kind of the battery belt now because they're building battery factories for EVs. Some people are calling it that. But this is a state that has a long history in its DNA of voters feeling like the economy doesn't work for them. And that has been, to a large degree, what J.D. Vance has run on. And Lee, you pointed out, that's what to a large degree, Tim Ryan has run on as well. And I think that's the secret sauce for Democrats in this state is that Sherrod Brown, the other senator, and Tim Ryan, who's a congressman in Ohio, have both kind of split from the Democratic Party. They're not running on the culture issues so much. I mean, there's some abortion that's talked about here and that kind of stuff, but they've stuck to economic issues. And I think that's what we're seeing where these polls can be really helpful. They're not going to tell you who's going to win. it's a tie, right? We can't tell you who's going to win. What we can tell you is that as voters in Ohio are going to the polls right now in early voting and all the way to election day, is that almost half of them, all they're thinking about is inflation and the economy, and which candidate you can most convince them that they have voters' backs will be the one that probably ends up being victorious here.
Well, Jay, as you know, reaching cell phone users is very important polling because if we don't reach out to cell phone users, we might miss certain groups of the population who are important to contact. Now, for me, in terms of my cell phone or smartphone use, if I lose my phone, it's sheer hysteria on my end. I mean, it's like couch cushions coming off of the sofa, papers being moved, just complete panic. Well, today we are joined by Sherry Melamog. She is Assistant Professor of Marketing and Walpole Family Faculty Scholar at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Sherry's most recent research focuses on the distinct psychological implications of smartphone use, and she is here with us today. Sherry, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I have to ask, is my hysteria normal? Am I alone in this?
I think probably most listeners can very much relate to what you just described. I know I can. Yeah. What you're describing is consistent with one of the key findings in my research program, which is that our phone can often act as a sort of adult pacifier or security blanket for us. So much like a child who can't find her security blanket would become very distressed, it sounds like you and many of us do as well.
We looked at this obviously podcast about polling and numbers and all that, and so there are a couple of things that are interesting. One is that 97% of Americans, according to a 2021 Pew Research report, have a cell phone of some kind. I think that's not unknown. 85% own a smartphone. I did ask at the very beginning in the open of the show, does anybody still call it a smartphone? Are we old by calling it a smartphone?
I'm not sure. So I call it a smartphone. I'm not sure if I'm at the sweet spot between old and young.
We'll just put you in it. We'll put you in the young sweet spot period.
Thank you.
That's
I
fine.
appreciate it.
But then the other thing that we found interesting was a June Gallup poll that looked at the impact of these smartphones and cell phones, and a couple numbers I want to throw out and then get your response to it. 58% of smartphone users say they use their phones too much. Yet 2/3 of Americans say phones have improved their lives. A little bit of discord there. 83% of American adults say they keep their smartphones near them almost all the time during their waking hours, and 72% say they're near them at night when they sleep. Last thing, 44% say they feel anxious if they lose their phone for a day. What does all of this add up to in terms of the impact that these totally ubiquitous and super powerful devices are having on our lives?
Yeah, I mean, just like many other pervasive phenomena, it's complicated, right? So at the end of the day, it's not going to be solely positive or solely negative. I think over the past several years, there's a lot of discourse around sort of the deleterious or dangerous effects of smartphone use. And, that's fair. Like you said, many Americans feel they overuse their phone. But at the same time, I think, and sort of one of the major points of my research is we can't ignore the benefits that are afforded by our phones, in part because they're not going anywhere anytime soon, right? And so I think it would be naive of us to not acknowledge the huge positive effects that this device has had on our lives. Part of the reason I argue that our phone becomes a sort of adult pacifier, or more technically, that's called an attachment object. A main reason is because it's always on our person, right? And so we learn over time that we can really rely on this device for whether it's getting information that we need in an instant, or distracting ourselves when we're stressed in a meeting or something, or distracting ourselves from boredom. There are many benefits that we derive instantaneously by virtue of having the device on us. And so, yes, can it become problematic? Of course, for many of us, it can become problematic. And even within users, sometimes it could be a good relationship and sometimes it could be a bad relationship. So, in terms of the total sum of, or whether it's on average positive or negative, is going to depend across people and even within people in a given month, let's say, right?
So I want to throw a couple more numbers out at you. According to Pew, again, this is also from 2021, 71% of Americans say that their kids use smartphones, but 42% say that their child spends too much time on them. That's from 28% to 42% of those whose children used one in both 2020 and 2021. When we're looking at younger Americans, we're looking at the next generation, what should we or what should parents be thinking about in terms of the right balance between and allowing their child or children to use a smartphone or a cell phone?
Yeah, this is a tough point. So first of all, when I started my research about phones as adult pacifiers, that was about 2013, and since then we've seen a huge uptick in how many younger folks are using their phones. Right, so it's almost like I want to get rid of the term adult from adult pacifiers. For some children, it might even be replacing more traditional attachment objects for them, which is a bit scary, right? Striking the right balance, it's hard because I think, there's peer effects too. So younger kids are seeing their peers having phones and they're going to be wanting phones. And I think that's happening more and more. Um, I mean, aside from sort of the more obvious prescriptions of trying to take some ownership or control over your child's cell phone use and monitoring what they're using, there's of course apps now that allow parents to have sort of more parental control over the content children are consuming. But and then, in schools, we hear movements like in middle schools or maybe even some elementary schools of not allowing smartphones in classes. And I think that's the right approach.
One thing that I wonder, distinguish between the device and the content. It seems like the device itself isn't the problem. This is an incredibly powerful computer. I mean, it's more powerful than the computers we had on our desks 15 years ago. And it does amazing things. The pictures we could take, it's replaced camera. It's done so many things. We could do a whole podcast on all the things it's done. But is the content really the problem here? Is some of these apps, and TikTok's one example, and I'm not making them the bad guy here, but the algorithms in TikTok and what they are designed to do, which is some would argue addictive, create addictive behavior. Is it the content that's the problem and not the device?
I'm so glad that you brought that up. This is how I talk about it when I present my research and talk about my work. So I think we hear the phrase, quote, smartphone addiction thrown around a lot, but it's often conflating problematic behaviors with the content being consumed on the device with problematic behaviors towards the device per se. And I really do think it's an important distinction. Again, problematic behaviors with things like social media, there's heterogeneity. People are going to differ in terms of how problematic their relationship is to content like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're, quote, addicted to your phone or that your phone has solely negative effects on you, even psychologically, right? If you have a problematic relationship with the content, it's a different story. And the phone is just sort of the medium for consumption there. It's an important distinction.
And so, Sherry, when we look at emerging forms of technology, what should we be thinking about?
Well, that's interesting. For example, if we take voice technology, we interact with that quite differently than we do for the most part with our phones, right?
Especially since your name is very close to Siri, I imagine at your house. It's very, hey, Siri. I mean, Siri, a Siri.
I'd like to remind folks that I came before Siri did. I would just like to make that point. But yeah, so we interact with things like Alexa quite differently than we do with our phone, right? So the way we operate our phone is we hold it, it's haptic, it's a touch screen, it's closer to our person, whereas interacting with things like voice assistants, we really aren't using our hands at all. And so in some sense, it's a less personal or intimate device in that way. I have newer work looking at people's interactions with voice technologies. And I find this is, a little bit of a tangent, but I think interesting. When we speak to voice assistants, there's sort of two things that happen. So one is we tend to think more ahead of time about what we want to say to the technology before indicating it. This is because we're often worried that voice assistants are going to misunderstand or mistranscribe our words. So ironically, it's actually making us sort of less spontaneous, which is interesting because when we speak to each other face to face, we tend to be more spontaneous than more written forms of communication, like texting on our phone, and secondly, when we talk even to an inanimate object like a voice assistant, we experience what's called self-presentational concern. So we feel conscious of how others might react to us, even if there's not another human in the room. And so, you're asking about how to think about emerging technologies. Like, there's so many differentiating factors between the smartphone and other technologies we might think of. And, like you said, we could do a whole podcast comparing different new technologies versus the phone. I think it's a really interesting topic.
Well, Sherry Malamud, we very much appreciate your time today. And hopefully you can come back and we can do a whole other podcast about comparing emerging technologies. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Short of politics, perhaps my favorite topic is the fun fact. And this week we're going to have fun. I guarantee we're going to have fun. And a poll from 1960, which was done by Gallup and provided to us courtesy of the Roper Center at Cornell University Archives. And the question was, what is your favorite season of the year? And in the answer nationally among 1,500 adults was spring, narrowly beating out summer, 36 to 33, autumn and fall at 21, winter at 4, and then a scattering for miscellaneous or
What's miscellaneous? What's a
I don't
miscellaneous
know.
season?
Close to, just on the brink between summer and fall. The equinox fans.
Ma-
How's
maybe
that?
On the
maybe-
day of the equinox, right? That's miscellaneous.
Or maybe it's the holiday season. I don't know.
There you go.
Yeah.
But here we go. Hope springs eternal. 36. This has been a very tragic week in baseball for me, with the Yankees getting knocked out. So spring training. Hope springs eternal. 36% say spring. I guess.
Is that your favorite
I should-
season? Lee?
I actually like fall because fall is a time where you have both baseball and football and elections, might I add, which are usually a good source of distraction for me when my baseball or football teams are not doing well. Not the case.
Mary,
this
I'm
year.
guessing most of the people in this poll were not thinking about sports or things that are going on in the season as much as the weather, maybe.
I would
don't know.
imagine that's
Myra?
my rationale.
What's
It's
your
weather.
What's your favorite?
A fall, definitely, because of the weather. Absolutely. With
So-
the exception of the kids going back to school, because that gets stressful, but fall, hands down.
I'm a fall too. I don't get how it's 21% other than, I mean, we live in the Hudson Valley in the Northeast, and this is, leaf country, right? Fall is beautiful. And, it's that change in season out of the heat and the humidity, and it's crisper and cooler and all that. I love fall. It's my favorite season. I was shocked that only 1 in 5 favored autumn and fall.
Well, if Barbara Carvalho was on this particular episode, she would be saying fall is not her favorite time because for her, when you get past fall, winter is not far behind. It gets cold, it gets darker earlier, and she's not a fall person.
Well, and to be fair, only 4% said winter. That I would love to see a correlation in 1960 among how many people in America, the proportion of adults who ski as a sport.
Yes,
And I wonder
yes.
if that's close to about 4%. So I don't know.
Yeah, I know some winter people, and they're not ice hockey fans, Mary. That's not the reason.
Well, ice hockey, it spans multiple seasons, fall, winter.
Yeah, that's
It even goes into, I think, the summer in terms of playoffs and Stanley Cup championships. So
Yes,
It's a long
this is-
season.
Yes, the sports do kind of go around and around all year round. But so spring number 1, summer, people like the sun. They like warm weather. And I think that's what we're getting when we're looking at the favorite season of the year.
That'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it will cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as we release it.
We'll see you next time.